It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend Gregory Rodriguez to discuss his groundbreaking new book on Mexican immigration and the future of race, Mongrels, Bastards, Orphans, and Vagabonds. Gregory is the director of New America's California Fellows Program, which supports many of the most impressive young writers and voices in the state. As many of you know, he's an op-ed columnist for the LA Times, where he writes about such issues as national identity, social cohesion, immigration, assimilation, race relations, and other social and political trends. He's also written for, among many others, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Economist, which praised him for decisively changing the understanding of the Latino experience in the United States. Gregory is also the founder of Zocalo, which is a lecture series in Los Angeles that's one of the most vibrant and successful public forums in Southern California, and in fact the entire country. I've been conditioned to think about Mexican immigration into the United States, and perhaps indeed all immigration, through one of two dominant narratives: the melting pot idea of complete assimilation to some set of American cultural norms and ideals, or as of a preservation of cultures, mosaics as it were, distinct from the American mainstream. Gregory Rodriguez in this book has been changing my mind about these rigid ideas and indeed about what American culture truly is. We're thrilled to have him here and look forward to his talk and the discussion that follows. Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. I wrote a book, by the way, it's on sale and back. It's about essentially what I believe Mexicans and Mexican Americans will do, the long-term effects on U.S. society. But what I'm going to talk about today is their effects, what I think are the most profound, is on the way we think about race. And in order to really understand, I think, the future of the influence of Mexican Americans on the U.S., one has to understand the past. So in a sense, my lecture will be what the Mexican past will tell us about the American future. I guess I can start with a little bit of a mythic narrative that I propose. Mexico's great myth, its tragic myth of its birth, is that its mestizo people, its mixed people, are born of Hernán Cortés, the conqueror, the European, the Spanish, the white man, and his indigenous mistress and translator, Doña Marina, or La Malinche. And it's a myth that Mexico hasn't really dealt with and gotten over yet. Mexico hasn't fully dealt with its mixture. You go to Coyoacán, you go to 57 Higuera Street in the beautiful neighborhood of Coyoacán, and there's no plaque on where Doña Marina once lived, because she has been portrayed since the early 19th century by Mexican nationals as a traitor. So our mother in this Genesis myth is a traitor, and our father is a rapist. What does that say about Mexicans and Mexican Americans and their ability to deal with their past? So I have proposed a new myth, and it's just as real as the other one. And it's straight out of the conquest of New Spain, Bernal Díaz del Castillo's brilliant eyewitness account of the conquest, which he published in the 16th century. He was there with Cortés. And he describes a story shortly after Cortés's men reached Cozumel in 1519. Sort of a friendly band of Mayans approached the Spaniards and said, you know, I don't know how they communicated, but they indicated in some way that there were two Christians nearby in the neighboring land of Yucatan. And Cortés said, well, let's get these men. Let's get them back. He gave some trinkets to a couple men. They hid a letter from Cortés in the beard of one of the men. And they went off to find the two men. The first man they found, Jerónimo de Aguilar, was still imprisoned. He was one of the two survivors of a shipwreck in 1511, 8 years earlier. And he was a prisoner to a Mayan chieftain, and he was still counting the days. He still read the Book of Hours, prayed the Book of Hours, and he thought it was a Wednesday. It was really a Sunday by then. But he was trying desperately to maintain his Spanishness and to maintain some semblance of his civilization as he saw it. Aguilar, his captors let him go, and for a few trinkets. And Aguilar then set off to find the other surviving shipwreck of that 1511, Gonzalo Guerrero, and he was about 15 miles away, and his position, his status had changed greatly since he had once been a slave as well. And now the Spaniards and Guerrero approach him. Mr. Guerrero is now married to a daughter of a Mayan chieftain. He is now in charge, the captain of war during times of war. He has tattoos. He has an earring, I believe. And the Spaniards, his would-be liberators, come to him and say, let's go. Come back with us to civilization. We'll buy your freedom. And he said, I can't. The Spaniards won't accept me. Look at me. I've changed. And then, of course, the Spaniards liberating him were dumbfounded. How could you not want to come back to civilization? And then finally, Guerrero, in the middle of this conversation, Guerrero's wife said, who are these slaves talking this savage language? Who are these people who have come to take you away? And Guerrero then turns to his would-be liberators and said, I can't go. Just look at my children, how beautiful they are. That is the first ever documentation of the mestizo in Mexico. I suggest that we embrace that origin myth. Because instead of turning our origins, our mixture, and understanding it as essentially a tragedy, having been conquered, we're turning it into an act of love. We're looking at it as an act of possibility. We all choose our myths. We have a myth every year, and it's our most popular national holiday in the United States, Thanksgiving. It's a myth of cooperation. Did all Anglo settlers really sit down and eat with Native Americans in the United States? Absolutely not. But myths are not just history. They're tales of our potential. They're tales of what we wish to be in addition to being some history. So I start with that proposition and then tell you that I've written a book looking at Mexican history and its collisions and its convergences with people as they came north since 1519 to today. And what I essentially found is this. The name of the book is Mongrels, Bastards, Orphans, and Vagabonds. And some of my friends have said, oh God, that sounds so horrible. What are you saying about Mexicans? And what I'm saying about Mexicans is that largely it's a mestizo population that never fit in to any rigid racial system. The first mestizos in the Valley of Mexico after 1519, until they were sort of discovered in 1530, were essentially the children of illicit unions of Spanish conquerors and their indigenous paramours. And some of them early on were adopted by the Spaniards. The child of Hernán Cortés and Doña Marina became a Spanish don. He was Martín Cortés. He went to Spain. He was an aristocrat, an early mestizo. However, and some were legitimized early on and became Spaniards. Others were rejected and went back to their mother's side of the family, indigenous villages, where they were shunned, where they were nobody, where they were marginalized. They didn't exist. By 1530, it had become clear that the term mestizo, of a mixed person, was synonymous with bastards. They were largely illegitimate children. And there was no place for them in the Spanish racial system, because as the Spaniards set up their colonial system in New Spain, as they called Mexico, they set up two repúblicas, obviously not speaking of modern republics, but a República de los Indios and a República de los Españoles. And those were the two racial categories in New Spain. And this group of mixed illegitimate bastards didn't belong legally in either system. So much so that their names were not on the laws. They were not on the law books. And if you weren't a Spaniard, and if you weren't an Indian, you didn't exist, you had no place in these societies, and you became many times vagabonds. Many times these illegitimate, unwanted, outcasted mestizos were vagabonds, running between indigenous villages and the center of Spanish colonies. So over time, this group, well, one of the interesting things I found in looking at sort of 16th and 17th century New Spain history is that one phenomenal historian said, it's almost as if the mestizos didn't exist. You couldn't see the word anywhere because there wasn't a place for them. Of course, the history of Mexico is the history of mixture. It's the essence of Mexican history. And this group was not supposed to exist. In part, there were good intentions and there were bad intentions. The Spanish crown set up a segregated system because they were very conscious that they were outnumbered by the Indians. They were very conscious that they were surrounded and they wanted the Indians elsewhere. The church, however, had more benevolent intentions. They wanted the Indians protected from those lousy Spanish. The Indians wanted, the church wanted Indians to be segregated so that the Spaniards wouldn't corrupt them, because they knew that they were being exploited at every turn. So the crown and the church didn't see eye to eye on the issue, but they did see eye to eye on the need for Spaniards and Indians to be segregated. There was a third, and this all makes sense today, if you give me a couple seconds, and there was a third interest involved, and that was business. The people who ran the encomiendas, these large groups, these large haciendas, which had coming to them by law large numbers of Indians who would work for these Spaniards who ran the encomiendas. And these men, these Spaniards, they were not the church, they were not the crown, wanted the Indians near them. They wanted labor. One great scholar at Berkeley who died many years ago, Woodrow Bora, he said that debt peonage, low-wage labor, is the essence of mestizaje in Mexico. This is where people mixed because of the labor systems. And what happened is, despite all good intentions, Indians would leave the villages and go to the Spanish town and work. And unbeknownst, and against the wishes of the crown and the church, they began and they kept on mixing. Now, as mixture occurred more and more with the Spaniards and the Indians, the elite, the Spanish elite in Mexico became more and more obsessed with their own racial purity. They took the notion of limpieza de sangre, with the cleanliness of blood that the Spanish had used during the Inquisition for people to prove they had no Jewish or Muslim ancestry, and they brought it to America and made it a racial idea, which is you were concerned about keeping your blood pure. And the Spaniards in America were particularly concerned with keeping their blood pure because everyone knew they were getting darker and darker by the generations. So what we have then, by the mid-16th century, we had this large group of people. And over the next 150, 200 years, this group that doesn't belong, they don't exist, they're illegitimate, they're vagabonds, they become the majority over time. They become the emblematic Mexican, the mestizo, the mixed, the hybrid. But does that mean Mexico solved its identity crisis? No. In 1950, Octavio Paz talked about Mexicans as having been orphans, as having been orphaned from both sides, both of their progenitors, orphans from their Spanishness, orphans from their indigenous roots, and having no mooring either. So what I look is that essentially the mestizo, the interstitial, the class that did not belong, the category, essentially ruined the Spanish colonial racial system. It destroyed it. As the Spaniards first started with the two repúblicas, and things got more mixed, they had a last-ditch effort to control mixture, to make sense of it. And you may have seen these in museums here and there, the casta painting genre, the genre of paintings that show and name and hierarchicalize different mixtures. A child of a Spanish woman or a Spanish man and an Indian woman was a mestizo, and different mixtures had different names for their offspring. And the system, the casta system, the caste system as it was called, hierarchicalized these mixtures. So by the percentage of whiteness that you had made you higher in society. And the point is, and some scholars early on said, wow, that's what an amazingly organized society. The point is, it was fantasy. The mixture was rampant, and this was the attempt by a fearful white Creole elite, that means Spanish born in the Americas, to control the mixture, to make sense of it and to say, you see, we're still on top. And it was also cautionary. A mestizo should not marry anybody with mulatto blood, because blackness will bring you will make it more tragic mixture than just Indian. And what's interesting is that Mexico was imported many African slaves. And this is sort of neither here nor there, but the gender ratio was completely lopsided. I believe it was 4 men to 1 woman among African slaves. So essentially what happened, where did the African men go? With indigenous women. So by the time Mexico gained its independence in the early 19th century, there were not a lot of non-mixed African origin people in Mexico. They had largely mixed into society, many of them having gotten freed through that system, because according to Spanish law, that your status as a person was determined by the status of your mother. So if you were a child born of an African slave and an indigenous woman, you were born free. So over time, the casta system was this last-ditch attempt to say the system, we're going to make sense of all that. And there were efforts to make people dress a certain way. Okay, you are a castizo. You're the child of a mestizo and a Spaniard, so you have to dress this way so we could identify you and keep you within these aspects of the law. You couldn't join this guild. You couldn't go to this. You couldn't have this kind of job. But it didn't work because the mixture got so rampant over time that even these wonderful court cases you find from 17th century Mexico, people changed. The judge would ask you what your race is. Oh, I'm Indian. Hour later, I'm mestizo. Hour later, I'm a little bit Spanish. It's okay. And that was the history of Mexican mixture in Mexico. What happens is, over time, as Mexicans came to the United States, a very similar thing happened here. Before before we get to the U.S. era, the settling of northern New Spain, the southwest of the United States, really occasioned further erosion of this racial system. First of all, Los Angeles, our politicians make a big deal out of the racial origins of the first settlers of Los Angeles, many of them of African origin, many of them mixed. And it's very true. Part of the reason is that the people who consider themselves Spanish and white in the Valley of Mexico had no incentives to go to Texas and California. They had a good thing going where they were. And so the people who did go far north were those who were on the margins of society, those who were mixed, or those who did have African blood. They came north. They settled places like California. And they were very far from Spanish control at that point. They're here in California. They're in Los Angeles, founded in 1781. And you look at the early censuses from the city of Los Angeles, and you'll find a variety, probably almost the majority of people who put their name and a race by their name, they change their race within 8 years by the next census. That Jose Vanegas says he is Indian in 1781, 1789 he's a mestizo. This sensibility, so this combination of this rampant mixture with this imposed rigid racial system created among Mexican mestizos a sensibility, a malleability, a sense of comfort, a comfort with ambiguity, and a willingness to dodge some of the rigid strictures of race. Eric Wolf, an anthropologist from the 1950s, wrote something very interesting about the colonial, and I'll move to the United States after this, the colonial mestizo in Mexico. He wrote that the mestizo's, quote, chances of survival lay neither in accumulating cultural furniture nor in cleaving to cultural norms, but in an ability to change, to adapt, to improvise. The ever-shifting nature of his social condition forced him to move with guile and speed through the hidden passageways of society, not to commit himself to any one position or to any one spot. And indeed, even after mestizos were acknowledged to be existent, they were not of one group. There was not a mestizo neighborhood because they had worked themselves way into the Brownian Spanish elite. There were mestizos in a variety of segments of society. They fit in where they could. So as Mexicans come north, they bring that sensibility and increase that sense of the malleability of race. At some point, the Anglo-American racial system collides with this sort of, I would call it a Hispanic Catholic racial system. And this sense of malleability among Mexicans always made distinctions. They were Mexican families of different shades. And Mexicans were now under a rigid racial system whereby a Mexican is a Mexican is a Mexican. and whereby Mexicans were treated as a race. Mexicans didn't take too much, but take to that very well, because they themselves made distinctions. And then it's unclear how that system really captured them. Mexicans confounded the Anglo-American racial system from day one. It wasn't clear what to do with them. Because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexicans were allowed to be citizens. And by virtue of the fact that they could become citizens, mean that they were de facto whites. From 1850 to 1920, the US government categorized Mexicans as whites. In 1930, as an attempt to, in the nativist group here, I believe it was run by a McClatchy here in California, they sought to have Mexicans recategorized as a race, the Mexican race. And by doing that, they were taking advantage of an early 1920s anti-immigration law which said nobody could come to the United States who wasn't eligible for citizenship. And since we're going to say Mexicans are no longer white, they are no longer eligible for citizenship, and therefore don't let any more in. That led to a very interesting strategy for the largest part of the 20th century of Mexican-American activists and advocates employing what could be called the other white race strategy. That essentially, in order to, whiteness was granted by one's access, rather, rights was granted by one's ability to say they were white. And so Mexican Americans, in Texas, a wonderful paper, in El Paso, the Department of Health decided they wanted to turn El Paso into a resort, a spa. So they said, we need our health numbers to go really good, okay? So we're going to declassify Mexicans. They're no longer white. We're going to put them in the Mexicans so the health statistics will shoot up. Mexican-American activists fought to overturn it. We are not going to be called non-white people because that means you have been taken away your rights, hard-earned rights. And so the other white strategy worked for a while, it seems, as Mexicans gained a little bit more civil rights over the years, but it had its faults. Clearly, there's a famous Hernandez case in Texas in which a Mexican-American man was convicted of murder, and his lawyer said to the judge, this was not a jury of his peers because there were no Mexicans on the jury. And the judge said, well, Mexicans are white, and it was an all-white jury. So the other white strategy had its problems. So what happens is, over time, in the 1960s, after Brown versus Board of Education, it became clear that African Americans had struck on a strategy of dealing with segregation and discrimination and taking advantage of Brown versus Board as a precedent. And over time, in the 60s, Mexican American activists sought to utilize and take advantage of Brown versus Board. And by the early 1970s, essentially Mexican activist groups had managed to get Mexicans reclassified for purposes of civil rights monitoring as a non-white group. So overnight, we went from white people to non-white people. The system has never known what to do. But again, Mexicans weren't exactly sitting there and sort of letting the imposition of racial categories weigh on them. They were trying, as they had throughout their history, they were trying to game the system as well. Well, if it's an advantage to me to be non-white, I'll be non-white. That was essentially what was said. 2 weeks ago, a month ago, there was a really poignant story of a non-federally accredited Indian tribe in Kansas. Have you seen this story? They sold 10,000 phony memberships to a phony Indian tribe to undocumented immigrants. These undocumented immigrants were willing to say, because essentially those memberships would essentially provide some sort of rights to become an American. It's a poignant story. But it's also part and parcel of this ability to say, if becoming this Indian in Kansas will get me a better status in the United States and allow me to stay, I'm your man. But how much time do I have left? I've run out of stories. So what we've had a history of being this group that didn't belong on either side, this group that didn't fit into the rigid categories. My sense is that after having tried so hard to fit into either side of the racial barrier, we're actually coming to embrace our sort of mestizo selves. that we're becoming to embrace the fact that we're mixed. It was Mexican-American intellectuals who turned that nasty word miscegenation, which was a bad word in the English language, racial mixture, miscegenation, to the use of the word mestizo, mestizaje, which is not only non-nasty, non-negative, it's almost celebratory on some level. Mexicans are not creating the mixture. America's mixing. They're hastening it. 2/3 of interethnic, interracial couples in California involve a Latino. The area, southwestern United States, which is the highest population of Mexican Americans anywhere in the United States, has the highest rate of intermarriage of any place in the United States. When the Anglo-Americans came, and the Southwest became territories and then states, quickly in most of these states, anti-miscegenation law, anti-racial mixing laws were passed everywhere except for New Mexico. The Hispanos did not allow the law to pass. So what we're having here is a group what I believe is embracing this sense of mixture, no longer playing each side of the racial divide. And it's confusing the system now. The Census Bureau, a colleague of mine, was on a 1980 Census Bureau meeting, and right after the 80th census, and a Census Bureau official was looking at the percentage of Mexican origin people who put other under their race. Right now we know that about 50% of Mexican Americans in the state of California put other under race. The other half put white. And the census official said, what's wrong with these people? They don't know what they are. They're white. So what happens to the validity of any given category system, when you have A, B, C, and D, and then E, none of the above, as you get millions and millions and millions of people putting E, it undermines the validity of every other category. That we have this group of people, there's millions of Americans, with this sense that we have the ability now not to fight on either side. There is this sense of strength. It was out of weakness that Mexican Americans sought either to be white or non-white. It was out of a sense of weakness that trying to apply for the benefits on either side, either the other white strategy or the other minority strategy. Now there's this sense that the system just doesn't apply to us and that we are mixed. We are other. And that poses, I think, a challenge to the Anglo-American racial system. And I think at this point it spells the end of it. So I'll end it on that. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you, sir. Here you go. Thank you. Any questions? Please. Uh-huh. Did you read Brown? Yeah, I reviewed it for the Los Angeles Times. And Brown, what I say is Richard created the mythopoetics of the Mestizo in the United States. I've sought to prove it. I've sought to show the bones of it and the nuts of it. So yes, very much so. But Richard's is one of the many Mexican-American intellectuals who've grappled with this. He's perhaps the best known. John Philip Santos, a brilliant Mexican-American writer, the first Mexican-American Rhodes Scholar. He talks about the Mestizo Codex, the DNA, and he asks the audience, will your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren be the same race as you? Many other Mexican-American, Octavio Paz talked about it. So that's the writer you may know, but Mexican-Americans, and varieties of them. The Chicana lesbian poet, Gloria Anzaldúa, wrote about this comfort with ambiguity. On all different sides, this is a subject that wasn't invented by any one person. It's been the subject. Again, Enrique Krause, the Mexican historian, called mestizaje the essence of the Mexican experience. And it is something that's been grappled with by Mexican intellectuals for 500 years and Mexican-American intellectuals. Please. I know you. I know.
What are your thoughts on the 2040 numbers where Mexicans in California will, have mentioned, and also show like current demand and many statistics that show the increased number of Latinos in California. What do you think that sort of means in terms of, overall? Do you have any
Yeah, I do.
children of these interracial couples, Latinos and Asian, Latinos and whites, and Latinos and blacks, are we classifying, are we going to have a new race in California? Is California going to have a new race?
That's a great question. And I think I can venture responses to both of them. One, the very notion of Hispanicity is broadening with this mixture. It doesn't mean you no longer call yourself Hispanic. 20, 30 years ago, studies show that Anglo-Mexican-American marriages led to the child leaving the Hispanic category and being white. Give you an example. Jeb Bush's children would most likely not have referred to themselves as Latino in 1958. But today it's a different cultural environment, and there's advantages to it. And he's clearly of olive skin, let's say George P. And they're identifying as such. But what that does is broaden the definition of Latino to include. Look at the Latino caucus here in California, in Sacramento. They're not all of both Mexican parentage, but there are mixed people in the Latino caucus. So that's a part and parcel of this broadening. So number one. And number two, we don't know what those Department of Finance numbers mean. There's a certain, plus we hear them every other day. Latinos becoming larger numbers. That's like every 2 weeks on ABC. And at a certain point, you have to say, so what? At a certain point, does that mean, there seems to me the underlying reason why that's on the news is because your life is going to change. But it's unclear how much your life is going to change, given the reality of acculturation, given the reality of people learning English. Mexican Americans have high rates of linguistic acculturation, even as many keep Spanish. It's unclear what that means in the end. I think at one point, I've written about this, maybe as the Latino politicians become such a big part of the state assembly and later of the state senate, maybe they're going to have to think of dropping the idea of having a Latino caucus. Absolutely. I think these days are coming. I think there is this notion when you move from minority to majority, there is this, and I think but the sensibility's already begun. Over my years as a writer, I've interviewed almost many Latino politicians, and they themselves don't want to be Latino politicians. Antonio Villaraigosa doesn't want to be the Latino mayor of LA. He wants to be the mayor of LA. They themselves have reached a glass ceiling of the Latino category. He doesn't want to be the Latino governor of California. He wants to be the governor of California. So I think as these numbers get big, you're going to see the racial politics shift, in part because that minority category isn't big enough for the majority. The sense that as Mexican Americans, as Latinos as a whole, 88% of Latinos in the state of California are of Mexican origin. There's a sense that this minority status isn't big enough, that we will have outgrown it. Any other questions? Yes.
Gregory, all through American history, nativism we've had waves of nativism grounded in the fear of the other. In the 19th century, it was Protestant fear of Catholics, fear of Southern Europeans, etc., being the other. Is some of the current wave of nativism we're seeing the fear of the other precisely of the Hispanic ambiguity, the loneliness of new immigrants not to think in the racial category?
I don't know. I think it's much more rooted than that. I think whereas other immigrant groups have had beginnings, middles, and ends. And there's a point at which you can say that Norwegian immigrants, the preponderance of them were native born, and therefore the preponderance of them were speaking English. You could do that. You could see the shift from immigrant culture to ethnic American culture. The difference with Mexican Americans, and this is not new by any means, the media discovers Latinos every 10 minutes, right? It's like, there's Latinos, and they do something special on it. There's been lots of Latinos here for a long time, and there's historical precedent. What we find is, we find cyclical anti-Mexican sentiment. And it's not just fear of the other. This was a former enemy at war for Texans. Remember the Alamo? There's something unique about anti-Mexican sentiment. It's this love-hate. It's this romanticization and this sort of abhorrence that's more than just the other. This is like, we need you, now get out. It's like This is more of the, I think people, when they hate Mexicans, sometimes they're hating the fact that they need them so much. And there's this frustration. I mean, our immigrant policy is, help wanted, keep out. So I think it's much more ingrained. I think anti-Mexican nativism is almost deeper and more personal and closer to the heart of the American spirit than are the other types of nativism. In fact, this is something, they like it so much, we do it every couple of years, That was a joke, sorry. Any other questions?
Where does the term pocho fit into the assimilation that's gone on this side as opposed to
the term pocho, which is essentially always meant watered down Mexican, and the implications were that Mexicans had sold their soul, sold their raza, sold their spirit for money, was part of what Mexico did for us for a long time. It did to us. Mexico was not a generous parent. Historically, Mexico has made Mexican Americans feel like second rate. And it was only until Vicente Fox, and it was a remarkable speech at MALDEF in 2001. It wasn't until Vicente Fox that official Mexico let us go. Vicente Fox gave an amazing speech a month before he took office, before he moved into Los Pinos. He came to Los Angeles and he said, Mexican immigrants are heroes, and we want them to do well, and we want them to dream the American dream, but don't forget us, send us some money. But Mexico has never been Mexico has looked down on that, hence the word, this sense that we had somehow betrayed the motherland. And indeed, we did. The motherland betrayed us. It was mismanaged. It still is mismanaged. And the point being that Mexico's coming to terms, those millions going north were living symbols of how ruinous that country had become. We were sores to the oligarchy in Mexico. We were sores. We were an example of how, I can't curse because there's television here. But what it was, next question.
In your book, do you deal with color, skin color, and race for, like, the Middle East?
No. The book is mostly a recasting of Mexican history from 1519 to the present. The book it does deal with color. It does deal with to the extent that Mexicans were always treated. There was no as much as the system at times the racial system tried to impose a uniform law against Mexicans. There were always exceptions, based on gender, based on the color of your skin. If you were the Mexican consul, you got to eat at a segregated coffee shop in South Texas. There were exceptions for certain people and lighter skin, and we know that's part of Mexico's pathology of its mixture. Mexico heralds its indigenous ancestry, but still prizes whiteness as status. Mexico still hasn't. To some extent, you see successful brown people in Mexico, you know they're Mexican Americans. That was a joke too. What are you? You're laughing, so I want you to ask the next question. Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much. Oh. He blurbed my book, so I cannot do that. I think he's a great man. And my book's for sale back there, so thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.